Well, hello everybody. Do you guys know what the significance of March 4th and March 5th is of this next year? Maybe it'll help. It's the same significance as March 13th and 14th of this last year. Nobody? That's okay. I didn't know either until I did the research. So it's okay. You're off the hook. It's a celebration in Jewish culture. It's called the Festival of Purim, and it's celebrating God's provision for His people. And more specifically, it's celebrating God's provision for His people in relation to the story of Esther. And that's where we're going to be spending our time today. You see, the story of Esther is a story where we learn that if we have a pulse, then God has a plan. Esther and Mordecai, they're the two characters that we're going to focus on. And what they do is they throw themselves into these tough situations that a lot of us tend to shy away from. And they do this because they know that God has a plan. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go through the entire story of Esther real quick. So buckle up. Where we start is with this guy. His name is King Ahasuerus. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's my best guess. It's King Ahasuerus, and he is a Persian king. We all know Persian kings are a little crazy. They're often quite eccentric and sort of dangerous if you're on their bad side. King Ahasuerus, he throws this ginormous party. We're talking huge. Like geographically, it stretched from roughly present-day Israel to present-day Pakistan. I mean, that's how big the Persian Empire was. And this party lasted in all these provinces for about a month or so. Total mayhem and party time. Queen Vashti, she was the queen at the time. She sort of dishonored this king, and it displeased him, and he dismissed her. The problem is that what's a king without a queen, right? So King Ahasuerus, he has this great idea, and he decides to have all of these women from all these different provinces come to his province. And he says, okay, I'm going to kind of send some of you home one at a time until I have my queen. I thought this was quite interesting because it reminded me of something, and it reminded me of The Bachelor, which kind of made me realize King Ahasuerus was the inventor of The Bachelor. Whether that's true or not. The story continues, and Esther is one of these women who is on The Bachelor before Christ. And Esther is she's Jewish, and she's this beautiful Jewish woman, and she's the one who wins, so to say, and she becomes the queen. Some time passes, and the king grows to really love Esther. Now, Esther has an uncle. It's her only close relative, and his name is Mordecai. Now, Mordecai, he's sitting outside of the gates this one day, and he hears this plot to kill King Ahasuerus. It's these guys that say, you know what, we're going to kill this guy. Mordecai has quite a dilemma, though, because King Ahasuerus has been quite harsh to Jews over time, and so he's thinking, well, we could just let him die. I don't need to say anything. We could just let him die, and my people would be fine. But then he thinks about Esther, one of his only relatives, and how he's one of her only relatives. And he thinks, man, if she's around, she could be in some danger. And he also feels like the right thing to do is to speak up. And so Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther decides to tell the king. And this is confrontation number one. You see, you don't ever want to tell a Persian king that somebody's about to kill him, because that's going to upset him, and you don't ever want to be around a Persian king when they're upset. This king was known for doing crazy things and killing people because they upset him. But Esther decides to tell the king, and it kind of sends this chain reaction off. So they find out that these guys are going to try to kill the king, and they find these guys, and they end up getting rid of them. And what ends up happening is this guy named Haman. He's a guy who gets promoted basically to the head of the military. And he does not like Jews, especially when he starts to decree, like, everybody should worship King Ahasuerus. And the guy who doesn't worship King Ahasuerus is Mordecai. Mordecai is walking around and he doesn't worship the king. And so Haman goes to the king and he says, look, can we take care of this guy Mordecai? The king goes, yeah, sure. And then Esther speaks up and she says, wait, that's my uncle, please don't. And the king goes, okay, that's fine. And so Mordecai's kind of off the hook. But then Haman, he gets even more angry, and he decides, you know what, fine, we're just going to kill all the Jews in all the provinces. And again, Esther's like, no, please don't. Like, these are my people. I love them. These people matter to me. And then again, the king says, okay. So the way the story ends up is that the king hears who God is and who their God is, and he's sympathetic, and in his heart he accepts and he admires their faith. And so he ends up praising Esther and Mordecai for this. And so I want to pull the handbrake on the story there. That's basically the story of Esther. And I think it shows us a really good example of how they knew they had a pulse, and they knew that God had a plan because of that. They dove headlong into a lot of kind of crazy things. Now this reminds me of something that I said a lot as a kid, and I think all of us have said this to some degree, especially the guys. When I was younger, I would build these jumps out of like plywood and like a 2x4 or something in the street, because that's the best place to build a jump. And I would get on my bike and I would ride off of it, right? And this one day I decided, hey Brian, that's my brother. My brother's name is Brian, and I said, Brian, lay here in front of the jump, and he's like, okay. And so he laid down, and I was like, Brian, I totally got this. Like, we've said that before, right? I've totally got this. Okay? Now, this is not a perfect metaphor. We know that all metaphors have a hole. But I think that this captures a little bit of that idea of like just that enthusiasm of going for it, right? I didn't think about what could possibly go wrong or how I could land on my brother and do something horrible to him. And I think that there's another example that comes to mind when I think about a little bit more of a complete metaphor here, and that is Lord of the Rings. Garrett, I'm really glad that you talked about Lord of the Rings, because I think it should be in every sermon. It's awesome. But this is Lord of the Rings. Have you guys all seen Lord of the Rings?
Yeah.
Everybody? Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Fellowship of the Ring specifically. That part when they're deciding who's going to take the ring to Mordor to destroy it. They're all sitting around and they decide that, they're deciding who has the most honor or who has the most skills, who's the one most worthy to take the ring. And they're all fighting, and it's mayhem, and they're accusing each other of not being good enough or whatever it is. And then Frodo speaks up, right? And we all know what he says. He says, I'll take it. He says, I'll take the ring to Mordor. Now, in most people's eyes, Frodo is probably the least qualified, because he's a small hobbit. He doesn't have any armor, any fighting skills, or anything. But I really admire Frodo's attitude towards this. I think that he's encapsulating this. He has a pulse, so there's got to be a plan. There's got to be a way for this. See, unlike me on the bike, Frodo counts the cost. He says, well, I don't know what my fate's going to be. I might die. I might not come back from this. I might return and be horribly scarred from this. And yet he says, but I know that I have a role in this. I know that I can move that ring closer to where it needs to be. So I do want to illustrate that this is exactly like Esther and Mordecai. They had lots of things that they were going into, and they could have just shied away from them because of fear or whatnot, but they decided to confront things headlong because they just believed so strongly that it was the right thing to do, and they believed so strongly that God had a plan through it. I want to again pull the handbrake here and get away from the illustrations real quick and get a little bit to some practical application for us. You see, I think that there's three things that we want to kind of monitor in our lives when we're trying to go for this, identifying this urge in us to believe that if we have a pulse, then God has a plan. I think there's three things we want to monitor. The first is to be courageous. This is kind of dealing with the idea that, God will not leave us, He won't forsake us, and that we don't have anything to be afraid of. And in fact, that is exactly what Deuteronomy 31 says. It says, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you, nor forsake you. Again, we see that wording of don't be afraid and how He won't leave you. The second thing that I think is really important for us to be watching in our lives when we're thinking about this idea of God, of how we have a pulse and God has a plan, is integrity. See, I think integrity is the notion that we're going to do what our heart says. I think God has placed a beautiful heart in us when we're a new creation. I think that we need to follow that. This is like that kind of thing, like following that good idea that you have, or following that place that God calls you. Titus 2:7, it says, "In everything set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity." This is like whenever you're talking, whenever you're encountering somebody, you are doing what is you. The third thing, so we have courage and we have integrity, and the third thing is going to be thinking about provision. If we are meditating on how God has provided for us and how much we matter to Him, I think that'll get us pretty far when we're talking about if we have a pulse, then God has a plan. This is in Matthew 6. I think we've all heard this one before, and it's gold. It says, "Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more important than them?" Again, this is just talking about, get some perspective. Esther and Mordecai had seen how they had provided for them over the years, and they dove back into that, and they said, God's provided for us now, He's going to keep providing for us. God has a plan. I want to kind of conclude with a couple urgings here. The first is that I want to encourage us to be like Frodo. I know, right? Frodo, he went right into a difficult situation, and he said, "I don't really know what's out there." He said, "I don't know what my fate will be, but I'm going to go do it anyway." There was something that told Frodo he was uncertain about his faith, but he knew that he could advance that ring closer to where it needed to be. Similarly, I think we could be like Mordecai and Esther here. You see, they did not discount God's power. They said when they were facing the death of their people, and when they were facing a king that was wildly unpredictable, they said, "You know what? We follow this king. We follow a different king." And they were bold enough to say that. But I think I want to end with this. This is a little bit of application for us. You see, we start things that we think are going to be like a good idea. Like maybe you start like a worship night, or you want to start like a mission trip, and we instantly go to a place where we say all the reasons why it can't work. And I think another thing that we do is we look at our lives and we say, like, I want to fix this thing in my life. There's something rotting inside of me, and I need to get rid of it. And then we decide, I can't change myself. This isn't going to work. A third thing that we do that I think is really common is we see people who need the gospel, and we say, I can't like present scripture to them. Like it won't work. And you see how like we make all these excuses for why things won't work, and just why these times when we have a pulse, why we say it won't work. We say so often that I have a pulse, but God doesn't have a plan. And it's just the opposite. We cannot discount God's power in our lives. We have to live in such a way that says, I have a pulse and God has a plan. Thanks.